When I called my son to ask what time I should head out for my grandson's college graduation party, the line went dead silent. Then my daughter-in-law snatched the phone away. She let out a sharp, shattering laugh and told me flat out that the celebration dinner had already happened the previous Saturday. She didn't mince words, telling me my rusty Ford F-150 grease-stained jeans and old jacket didn't exactly fit the aesthetic of the wealthy Dallas investors they'd invited. A week later, they were standing outside the heavy iron gates of my ranch, sobbing hysterically in a torrential Texas downpour, begging me for a financial lifeline on their knees in the mud. I just looked at them through the rain, stone-faced, and coldly ordered them to get the hell off my land forever. The air in my garage smelled like old motor oil, leather, and solder. I ran a calloused thumb over the hood of the 1969 Ford Bronco I'd spent the last 4 months restoring. I've had this truck for 10 years, ever since I hauled it out of a junkyard. I spent countless days and nights grinding away every single speck of rust, rebuilding the V8 engine from scratch, and hand-stitching premium saddle leather onto the seats until the deep harbor blue paint practically glowed under the garage lights. I built this truck specifically for my grandson Julian. He'd just graduated at the top of his class from Texas A&M with a degree in petroleum engineering. I wanted him to start his career with something solid, durable, and built with love. The heavy wrenching left my shoulders aching, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that comes from providing for your family. I wiped the black grease from my hands with an old rag and checked my stainless steel watch. It was Thursday morning. 2 weeks earlier, I'd sat proudly in the stadium bleachers, watching Julian walk across the stage. My son Derek mentioned back then that they were planning a private family barbecue in Dallas after the official ceremony to celebrate all of Julian's hard work. I'd been waiting on the details. I picked up my phone from the workbench, its screen covered in a thin layer of sawdust. I wiped it on my jeans and hit Derek's speed dial. It rang 3 times. I looked at the uninstalled chrome side mirrors on my bench, wondering if I should ask Derek if I needed to bring my smoked brisket or if they were getting the whole thing catered. Finally, the ringing stopped and the call connected. I said hello and asked what time I should drive over on Saturday. The line fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. In the background, I could faintly hear elegant classical strings playing and the distinct clinking of expensive crystal glasses. Derek cleared his throat and started stuttering, mumbling some nonsense about scheduling conflicts and communication breakdowns. Then the entire vibe of the call changed. After a sharp rustling sound, the phone was violently yanked out of Derek's hand. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, came on the line. Her voice dripped with a toxic mix of mockery and absolute arrogance. She gave a sharp scoff, not even bothering to spin a polite excuse or a white lie. She told me straight up that the graduation party had already taken place the previous weekend at the Petroleum Club in downtown Dallas. I froze right there in the middle of the garage, the rag slipping from my hand and hitting the concrete floor. Chloe kept talking in a casual, poison-soaked tone, explaining that it was a high-level networking gala. They'd invited prominent private equity partners and commercial real estate moguls. She made it crystal clear that my presence would have been a public relations disaster. She said my rough hands, faded flannel shirts, and 20-year-old pickup truck didn't fit the flawless, high society aesthetic of their guest list. She told me I would completely ruin the image of the successful class they were trying to project to their investors. Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of her words, I heard the sharp click of the call disconnecting. The flat, mechanical drone of the dial tone filled my ear, replacing the voices of my family. I didn't throw my phone and I didn't yell. I just gently set the device down on the workbench next to a neat row of wrenches. I looked at the blue Bronco I'd poured my soul into. The quietness of the garage felt completely different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the realization of a deep betrayal. I walked out of the garage and climbed into my old, reliable Ford pickup. The engine started with a steady, mechanical heartbeat. I drove out of my sprawling ranch in the hill country and headed straight toward the affluent neighborhood of Highland Park in Dallas, where Derek and Chloe lived. It took nearly 3 hours of driving to reach that tree-lined neighborhood filled with luxury cars. To avoid drawing attention, I parked my truck 2 blocks away from their manicured, golf course-like lawn. I walked down the spotless sidewalk until I had a clear view of their massive modern mansion. The scene in front of me was staggering. 3 large commercial transport trucks were parked in their circular driveway. A professional event crew was tearing down a massive white luxury tent that covered their entire backyard. I watched workers carry out massive crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and velvet lounge chairs. This wasn't a family backyard barbecue they forgot to invite me to. This was a meticulously planned, wildly expensive production. They had intentionally excluded me from celebrating my only grandson's achievement because they saw my image as an old Texas farmer as a liability to their social climbing. I stood on the sidewalk, digesting the sheer scale of their deception. I felt absolutely no urge to storm up to their front door and demand an explanation. An argument would just waste energy and give them a chance to call me emotional or unreasonable. This disrespect was absolute, and because of that, it required an equally absolute response. I turned my back on the massive estate and walked back to my truck. My pulse was steady. The initial shock had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I drove back to my ranch. After parking, I bypassed the garage and walked straight into the old house I'd earned through decades of sweat and hard labor. I walked down the hallway and stopped at the heavy oak door leading to my private study. I unlocked the fingerprint scanner and stepped inside. The room was dim, smelling of old paper and cigars. I walked straight to the corner of the room where a massive military-grade safe was bolted into the concrete floor. I spun the combination dial, right to 32, left to 14, right to 46. The heavy internal locking mechanism released with a satisfying metallic thud. I pulled open the thick steel door. Stacks of legal documents and land deeds sat inside. I reached past them and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. The cover was stamped in faded gold lettering with the words "Sterling Consolidated." I carried the heavy book over to my desk and switched on the brass reading lamp. I flipped to the most recent financial summary page. Derek and Chloe had always assumed I was just a retired mechanic, living out his days in rural Texas on a modest pension. They treated me with the condescending pity reserved for the weak. They had no idea that 12 years ago, I quietly sold my oil rig valve patents and equipment rental company for $55 million. To keep Derek from becoming a lazy, entitled parasite, I placed every single cent into an ironclad blind trust. I looked at the complex financial web detailed in the ledger. They thought they had surpassed me. They thought they were the architects of their own success. They were dead wrong. I shut the ledger, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I was no longer a cast-aside country grandfather. I was the true head of Sterling Consolidated, and it was time for a complete audit of my son's arrogant life. I left the heavy ledger in the study and walked back out to my truck. The drive from my quiet country ranch to the towering glass jungle of the downtown Dallas financial district took an hour and a half. The morning rush hour traffic was heavy, but I didn't mind. It gave me plenty of time to lock away the last remaining shreds of paternal weakness. I pulled my dented pickup into the underground parking garage of the tallest skyscraper in the city. I parked perfectly between a silver Porsche and a black Maybach. I climbed out, smoothed down my flannel shirt, and walked with purpose toward the private elevators reserved for executive clients. The polished steel doors opened on the 60th floor, revealing the sprawling, marble-floored reception area of the city's most ruthless, top-tier corporate law firm. The young woman at the front desk, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, looked up from her dual monitors. For a fraction of a second, confusion flashed in her eyes as she took in my worn work boots and faded jeans. But recognition hit her instantly. She stood up immediately, her posture snapping into a respectful line as she greeted me politely. clearly addressing me as Mr. Sterling. She didn't ask if I had an appointment. She simply pressed a button on her desk phone and told me Harrison was already waiting for me in his corner office. I walked down the long, silent hallway, passing glass-walled conference rooms where men in expensive suits were arguing fiercely over corporate mergers. I reached the heavy oak door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. Harrison sat behind a massive desk that overlooked the city skyline. He had been my chief wealth manager and corporate attorney for the past 20 years. He was a cold-blooded professional who only cared about facts, figures, and legally binding consequences. He looked up from his paperwork, took off his gold-rimmed reading glasses, and gestured for me to sit down. He noted aloud that I rarely visited the office in person without a scheduled quarterly review. I took a seat in the leather chair across from him and told him that a sudden shift in family dynamics required us to initiate an immediate, comprehensive audit of all my assets. Harrison opened his laptop and typed in a highly secure authorization code. He asked me what specific event had triggered this unscheduled visit. I kept my tone absolutely level. I told him that Derek had just hosted a lavish college graduation party for Julian at the Dallas Petroleum Club and explicitly banned me from coming because my old Texas farmer look would offend his wealthy high society guests. Harrison stopped typing. He looked at me, his face hardening into a look of cold, sharp anger. He knew the truth about my life, a truth that Derek was completely blind to. Harrison pulled up the master file for the blind trust on his screen. He leaned back in his leather chair, recalling the exact conversation we'd had in this very room 12 years ago. We talked about the day I signed the paperwork selling off my equipment rental company, an acquisition that brought in a massive cash payout of $55 million. Harrison remembered how back then Derek had just started hitting me up for huge loans to fund his ridiculous luxury lifestyle, entirely assuming he would eventually inherit my entire business. That day I told Harrison I'd rather burn the money to the ground than watch my son use it to become a lazy, arrogant parasite. That was the exact reason we set up the irrevocable blind trust in the first place. I put every single dollar of that $55 million, along with the deeds to my personal properties, directly into the trust. I appointed an entirely neutral, third-party asset management firm to handle the investments. To Derek and the rest of the world, my business had simply gone under during a bad economy, and I had retired on a modest pension to a remote piece of ranch land. I wanted Derek to build his own life from scratch, to understand the true value of hard work. Instead, he married a woman obsessed with social status, and he spent his life pretending to be rich while looking down on the very father who had secretly secured his future. I told Harrison I wanted to know exactly how Derek was currently funding his lifestyle. Throwing a massive party at the Dallas Petroleum Club cost tens of thousands of dollars. Derek was just a regional VP at a mid-sized tech company, and his wife, Chloe, ran a boutique art gallery that was bleeding cash. The math didn't add up. I instructed Harrison to use the private investigator our firm kept on retainer to run a total financial background check on their recent activities. I wanted to see their debts, their loans, and every desperate move they were making to keep up their fake, wealthy image. Harrison nodded in agreement and started typing rapidly. He tapped into peripheral banking networks and public financial registries. For several minutes, the only sound in the spacious office was the crisp, rapid clicking of his keyboard. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of his typing stopped. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming tense and heavy. Harrison leaned closer to his high-resolution monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read a newly generated financial report. He clicked on another secure link, opening a scanned legal document pulled straight from the county clerk's database. Harrison looked up from the screen. His professional, detached demeanor was completely gone, replaced by an expression of absolute, grim severity. He turned the laptop around and slid it across the smooth glass desk toward me. He told me we didn't even need to hire a private investigator to find out how Derek was financing his fake life. He said the system had just flagged a massive, highly irregular transaction tied directly to my legal name. He pointed a steady finger at the digital file on the screen, telling me to look closely at the signature block at the very bottom of the last page. I leaned forward, examining the bright screen. I recognized the official format of the document instantly. It was an application for a commercial bridge loan in the amount of $5 million. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. What completely caught my attention were the specific assets listed as collateral for this massive loan, and the incredibly familiar authorized signature on a document that was a total fraud. I stared at the forged signature on the screen, feeling a profound shift happen inside my chest. It wasn't the hot sting of anger, but a cold, heavy sense of absolute certainty. Derek hadn't just insulted me, he had committed a federal crime. I asked Harrison how he had found this document so quickly. Harrison explained the mechanics of the blind trust I had established. 10 years ago, when I placed my 500-acre ranch into the trust, I had instructed the asset managers to put an ironclad lock on the title. Any attempt to alter the deed, place a lien on the property, or use it as collateral would instantly trigger an automatic alert sent directly to the law firm's servers. Harrison leaned forward, typing a quick sequence of commands into his secure portal. He explained that Derek had submitted this commercial bridge loan application 4 days ago to a private lending outfit in Dallas called Lone Star Capital. The financial institution started a routine background check on the collateral. The exact moment the county clerk accessed the digital deed to verify ownership, my trust's security protocol sent an automatic warning straight to Harrison's server. Derek thought he was just dealing with a sleepy small-town county clerk's office. He had no idea he had just tripped the digital alarm system of a $55 million financial fortress. I told Harrison to dig deeper. I needed to see the entire financial foundation of my son's life. Harrison activated his firm's forensic accounting software. He had legal access to peripheral banking networks, allowing him to track credit inquiries and outstanding debts tied to Derek and Chloe's social security numbers. The large monitor on the desk split into multiple windows, each one filling up with spreadsheets, credit histories, and bank statements. The reality of their fake wealthy life was laid bare in cold, hard, undeniable numbers. Harrison pointed to a column of data highlighted in red, explaining the true state of Chloe's so-called boutique art gallery. She marketed herself as a highly sought-after art consultant for the Dallas elite, but the numbers told a completely different story. She was 4 months behind on the rent for her gallery space in a high-end commercial district. She owed massive amounts of money to independent artists, overseas framing suppliers, and high-end shipping companies. Her business account was completely drained, and she was barely staying afloat on high-interest lines of credit that had been maxed out weeks ago. She was facing imminent bankruptcy and multiple civil lawsuits from unpaid vendors. Next, Harrison opened Derek's financial profile. Derek always bragged about his hefty income as a tech executive, but the record showed his base salary was shockingly low, and he had absolutely no substantial savings. Every single dollar he earned went directly to the lease payments on their 2 Porsches, the mortgage on their massive Highland Park mansion, and the minimum payments on 6 different premium credit cards. They were drowning in a sea of debt, robbing Peter to pay Paul, terrified that their wealthy social circle would find out they were completely broke. That explained why they were so desperately in need of a $5 million commercial bridge loan. They needed a massive, immediate injection of cash to pay off angry vendors, pull the gallery back from the brink of foreclosure, and maintain their illusion of wealth. But no legitimate bank would ever approve a loan of that size without substantial collateral. That was when Derek decided to steal his own father's land. I asked Harrison to pull up the recent charges on their maxed-out credit cards. I wanted to see the exact financial footprint of that graduation party at the Dallas Petroleum Club. Harrison isolated the transactions from the last 14 days. The list of charges scrolled down the screen, painting a shocking picture of reckless spending. They spent $12,000 on vintage champagne and top-shelf liquor. They paid $18,000 for the venue rental, and the massive crystal chandeliers I had seen on their lawn. They spent another $25,000 on a high-end catering service. They paid for this entire circus, using a high-interest credit card they had absolutely no way of paying off. I looked at the massive total, feeling a deep sense of confusion. You don't borrow $55,000 just to celebrate a college graduation. The logic was completely wrong. I told Harrison to track down the event guest list from the club. I needed to know exactly who was in that room that night. Harrison bypassed a low-level firewall into the club's vendor portal, finding the official event registry Derek had submitted to the front door security team. Harrison clicked a button, and the office printer buzzed to life. He handed me a fresh, white sheet of paper containing the names of the 200 guests who attended the party. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and put them on. I scanned the list, looking for the names of Julian's college friends, his engineering professors, or the young men and women he'd pulled all-night study sessions with over the last 4 years. There wasn't a single college student on the list, not a single professor. Instead, the paper was packed with the names of the most powerful financial players in Dallas. I recognized the names of managing partners from elite private equity firms. I saw aggressive venture capitalists and ultra-high-net-worth commercial real estate developers. I saw the names of the people who controlled the lifeblood of commercial investment in downtown Dallas. The final piece of the puzzle slammed violently into place, completely shattering the last shred of illusion I held for my son. The event had absolutely nothing to do with celebrating my grandson's academic achievements. Julian was merely a decorative prop. The graduation was nothing more than a convenient excuse to get 200 wealthy investors into a room so Derek and Chloe could ply them with expensive alcohol and project a false image of immense success. They used a milestone in my grandson's life as a high-stakes networking event to pitch their failing businesses and secure the private endorsements needed to finalize that fraudulent bridge loan. They didn't ban me from the party just because I wore flannel shirts and drove an old truck. They banned me because my presence would have shattered the elaborate lie they spent years building. While they were busy pretending to be part of the elite high society, they couldn't risk me casually mentioning my simple country life to some private equity investor over drinks. I took off my reading glasses, folded the printed guest list, and slid it into my jacket's breast pocket. The audit was over, and the time for quiet observation was officially dead. Harrison pushed his heavy leather chair back and walked over to the high-speed printer in the corner. The machine let out a loud hum, spitting out a massive stack of warm paper. These were the physical loan documents he had managed to pull from the secure financial portals. He carried the thick stack across the room and dropped it right in the dead center of the glass desk between us. The heavy thud of paper hitting the thick glass was sharp and final. He told me to look closely at the first page of the agreement. It was a commercial bridge loan contract from Lone Star Capital, a private lending outfit in Dallas notorious for its ruthless, predatory tactics. Harrison began breaking down the exact nature of the financial trap my son had walked into. He explained that given Derek and Chloe's current financial situation, a traditional bank would never lend them a single dime. Conventional commercial lenders require extensive proof of legitimate income, solid credit scores, and a track record of successful business operations. Lone Star Capital didn't care about any of that. They didn't care about Derek's mediocre corporate salary or the fact that their credit cards were completely maxed out. Lone Star Capital only cared about the physical asset backing the debt. The loan amount was $5 million, but the terms attached to it were absolute financial suicide. Harrison ran his silver pen across the fine print at the bottom of the page. The interest rate was locked in at a staggering 22%. Worse, the entire agreement was structured as a balloon payment. That meant the entire $5 million principal balance, plus all accumulated interest, had to be paid in full, in one massive lump sum, in exactly 6 months. I asked Harrison how Derek honestly expected to pay back over $5 million in such a short window of time. Harrison flipped to the second section of the printout, which detailed the comprehensive business plan Chloe had submitted to the lender to justify this massive funding. In the official application, Chloe claimed her art gallery was on the verge of signing an exclusive, multi-million-dollar art procurement contract to outfit modern artwork for a massive new luxury hotel development coming to downtown Dallas. She projected millions in upcoming revenue to cover the loan. However, Harrison had already instructed his paralegals to cross-reference this specific claim. The hotel development group had never even heard of her gallery. The entire business plan was completely fabricated, a desperate lie whipped up purely to secure the cash. Then Harrison reached into his lower desk drawer and pulled out a thick red binder. He said we needed to look even closer at the truly disastrous state of Chloe's art gallery. He opened the binder to reveal copies of 4 separate civil lawsuits filed against Chloe in local courts within the last 2 weeks. Chloe hadn't just failed to pay her commercial rent or her suppliers. She was actively running a scam on her wealthy clients. Harrison explained the mechanics of her crumbling business model. She would demand a 50% upfront cash deposit from her affluent clients, claiming the money was needed to secure incredibly rare modern art pieces at European auction houses. However, Chloe never ordered any art. Harrison pointed to the bank statements attached to the legal filings. Chloe had collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in client deposits and transferred that money directly into her personal checking account. She was committing grand larceny. She used her clients' money to fund the leases on their luxury cars, buy expensive designer clothes, and finance the lavish graduation party I had just discovered. Her clients had finally realized the artwork was never coming. They were demanding their refunds, but the bank accounts were completely dry. If she couldn't get this $5 million bridge loan by Friday to pay them back, the civil lawsuits would instantly escalate into criminal charges for grand theft. That was the true source of their absolute desperation. They weren't just trying to save a failing gallery. Chloe was desperately trying to stay out of state prison, and Derek was acting as her willing accomplice, perfectly prepared to sacrifice my land to cover up her criminal activity. I looked back down at the loan documents, focusing on the section detailing the collateral. My 500-acre ranch was listed in bold black ink, with a recent appraisal value of $7.5 million. Harrison explained Lone Star Capital's predatory strategy. The lenders knew there was absolutely no way Derek could pay back the loan in 6 months. They were completely banking on him defaulting. The moment Derek inevitably missed that balloon payment, Lone Star Capital would immediately foreclose on my property. They would bypass lengthy court proceedings because the bridge loan contained incredibly strict, irrevocable forfeiture clauses. They intended to seize my 500 acres of pristine, undeveloped land, split the valuable water rights into lucrative commercial parcels, and sell it off for double the appraisal value. Lone Star Capital wasn't in the business of lending money to help struggling businesses. They were in the business of stealing highly valuable assets from desperate fools, and Derek had walked straight into their trap, offering up our lifetime of hard work as bait. I asked Harrison how Derek managed to bypass the strict legal requirements for transferring property deeds in the state of Texas. A transfer of this size requires certified notarized signatures to be considered legally binding. Harrison turned to the very last page of the dense loan agreement. He pointed the tip of his pen to a blue official notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner of the paper, right next to my perfectly forged signature. Harrison recognized the name of the notary printed on the seal. It was a guy who operated a shady title loan office on the edge of the city's industrial district, someone notoriously known in legal circles to look the other way for any rule if the cash bribe was fat enough. Derek had bribed a corrupt notary official to validate a forged signature, escalating his reckless behavior from simple fraud to a deeply serious federal felony. Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather chair, lacing his fingers over his lap. He looked at me with an expression of absolute professional gravity. He began outlining my legal options. He told me we had more than enough irrefutable evidence right now to contact federal authorities. If we handed this thick file over to the district attorney today, Derek and Chloe would be arrested before the loan funds could ever be dispersed. They would face decades in federal prison for bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Harrison warned me that if I allowed the loan to officially go through, I risked getting tangled up in a massive, expensive legal battle to claw my own land back from Lone Star Capital. I sat in the heavy leather chair, absorbing the absolute destruction of my son's choices. I felt no sadness, no pity, and no paternal weakness. I felt only a cold, mechanical resolve settled deep in my chest. Derek had made a calculated decision to destroy my life to save his own fake reality. He viewed me as a disposable resource, a naive country old-timer he could easily steal from. I looked Harrison dead in the eye and told him that calling the police right now was too quiet. It would allow them to hide behind closed doors and take a quiet plea deal. I instructed Harrison to draft a legally binding certified letter concerning the fraudulent collateral. We weren't going to stop the loan today. We were going to let them think they won. We were going to let them gather their wealthy investors and celebrate their fake victory at a lavish dinner on Friday night. Then I was going to rip their entire world to shreds in front of the exact crowd they sacrificed me to impress. I asked Harrison to pull the specific deed transfer document out from that thick stack of printed financial records. I needed to see the exact mechanics of my son's betrayal with my own eyes. Harrison pulled a single dense sheet of paper from the pile and laid it flat in the dead center of the glass table. It was the official county transfer application, the primary legal instrument used to pledge physical property as collateral for a commercial loan. I looked at the property description block at the top of the form. There, printed in cold, uncompromising black ink, was the exact legal plotting of my 500-acre estate. That wasn't just a random piece of real estate. Those 500 acres represented the culmination of my entire life's labor. That was where the garage stood, the exact place where I had spent the last 4 months meticulously restoring that Ford Bronco for Julian. It was land I bought 30 years ago with the hard-earned profits from the early brutal days of my oil field equipment business. It was a sanctuary surrounded by ancient oak trees and clear creeks, the only place I found absolute peace after my wife passed away. Derek knew exactly what that land meant to me. He grew up running through those woods. He knew it was my forever home. Yet, he had coldly handed it over to a predatory lending company just to cover the massive debts from his wife's scam of a gallery. I read through the dense legal paragraphs detailing the transfer of rights. The document stated loud and clear that I, as the sole owner, was willingly and knowingly surrendering all equity in the property to secure a $5 million commercial bridge loan. It contained aggressive clauses acknowledging the risk of immediate foreclosure upon default. It was a document designed entirely to strip a man of his most valuable asset, leaving absolutely no room for legal recourse. The sheer audacity required to submit a form like this was mind-blowing. Derek had walked into a title office, looked a government official dead in the eye, and passed this document off as real. I shifted my gaze to the bottom of the page. I needed to see the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to see exactly how Derek had managed to convince a notary that I had agreed to this financial suicide. My eyes locked onto the primary signature block. A cold, heavy sensation spread rapidly through my chest, completely replacing any lingering anger with a chilling sense of absolute horror. There, written perfectly on that thick white paper, was my name. This wasn't a clumsy forgery attempt. It wasn't a rushed scribble or a careless imitation born out of panic. It was a flawless, absolute duplication of my real signature. I leaned closer to the desk, tracing the strokes of the blue ink with my eyes. The capital letters had the exact sharp, distinct angles I'd been using since I was 20 years old. The loops of the lowercase letters carried the exact same fluid motion. Even the slight, deliberate tail I always left at the end of my last name was replicated perfectly. I realized the chilling implication behind what I was looking at. This level of incredible forgery couldn't be done on a whim. It required high intensity, precisely calculated and repeated practice. I know the mechanics of handwriting. A standard forgery usually shows tiny hesitations, where the pen pauses as the forger tries to remember the next stroke, creating microscopic deposits of ink. This signature was completely free of those flaws. The ink flowed smooth and confident. Derek had been deliberately studying my handwriting for a long time. He must have taken old birthday cards, canceled checks, or personal letters I'd sent him over the years. He had sat at the desk in his expensive suburban mansion, carefully mimicking the specific movements of my hand, practicing over and over again until he could execute my identity with absolute, terrifying perfection. This was by no means an impulsive crime of desperation. This was a premeditated psychological violation. My own flesh and blood had spent countless hours learning how to steal my identity so he could seamlessly steal my home. I thought back to 30 years ago when he and I sat at the kitchen table. I wrapped his tiny hand in mine, teaching him how to hold a pencil properly and write his own name. I taught him how to write every single letter with pride. Now, decades later, he had weaponized that skill against me. I remembered the phone call from the day before. I remembered Chloe mocking me through the receiver, laughing at my work boots and my rusty truck. While she was publicly humiliating me and deliberately keeping me away from my grandson's graduation party, Derek was privately mastering the forgery that would make me homeless. They worked together like a pair of synchronized, cold-blooded predators. They thought my quiet personality and simple clothes meant I was a weak, easy target. I looked up from the fraudulent document and met Harrison's steady gaze. He didn't offer any empty words of comfort. He knew that in a room ruled by facts and irrefutable evidence, sympathy was useless. I tapped the forged blue ink on the paper with my calloused index finger. I told Harrison that this signature proved Derek possessed a malice and an entitled sense of privilege I had never truly understood. I had spent my life trying to protect him from the corruption of unearned wealth. I set up the blind trust specifically to teach him the vital importance of hard work and integrity, but the rot had clearly taken root deep inside his character. This perfect forgery on the desk was the ultimate proof that Derek was completely past the point of saving, far beyond the reach of any paternal redemption. He had crossed a legal and moral boundary from which there was no turning back. He weaponized his intimate knowledge of me to execute a highly sophisticated federal financial crime. I carefully folded the deed transfer document, ensuring that perfect forgery was protected safely within the creases. I slid the paper into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. That visual confirmation was the final bit of fuel my brain needed. The audit was officially over. I possessed the undeniable proof of their betrayal. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling the weight of the document against my chest. The time for quiet observation was done. It was time to step directly into their fake world and burn their manufactured reality to ash. I left the towering glass buildings of the financial district, driving my pickup toward the city's historic arts district in Highland Park. This was the most expensive retail corridor in the entire state. The narrow, spotless streets were lined with imported luxury cars, private valet stands, and high-end commercial galleries. I parked my 20-year-old beat-up pickup directly in front of a wide storefront with massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Etched beautifully into the thick glass in elegant gold lettering were the words, "Chloe Sterling Fine Art." I sat in the driver's seat, letting the engine idle for a long moment as I looked through that pristine glass. The sickening irony of the visual display in front of me was overwhelming. Now I knew the absolute truth about her business. I knew through forensic accounting that she was entirely bankrupt, facing insurmountable debt and multiple civil lawsuits for grand theft. Yet from the outside, the gallery looked like an unshakable fortress of immense wealth and high society influence. I killed the engine, stepped out of the truck, and hit the clean sidewalk. I didn't bother dusting off my faded flannel shirt. I didn't try to clean the dried mud from my heavy steel-toed work boots. I walked straight to the towering glass doors, pushed them open, and stepped directly into a completely manufactured world of luxury. The air inside the massive room was thick with the scent of expensive florals and custom leather. The floors were poured concrete, polished to a blinding white sheen that reflected the lighting overhead like a calm lake. Massive custom crystal chandeliers hung from the exposed industrial ceiling, casting a warm, flawless glow over several perfectly staged lounge areas. I walked slowly past a display of imported velvet sofas and solid marble coffee tables. The walls were lined with paintings claiming to be from prominent modern artists. I looked at the outrageous price tags tucked discreetly beneath the silk cushions. None of this actually belonged to her. Every piece of high-end furniture and every questionable painting in this massive room had been bought with money she had explicitly stolen from the clients who trusted her. This wasn't a legitimate art space built on hard work and talent. It was an elaborate theater set built entirely on desperate lies and commercial fraud. I stood near the wide entrance, letting my calloused hands hang heavily at my sides. I was the physical embodiment of everything my son and daughter-in-law utterly despised. I was rough, unpolished reality standing inside their temple of fake perfection. At the far end of the sprawling gallery, a group of people was gathered around a massive custom quartz island. Derek and Chloe stood proudly in the center of the crowd like monarchs holding court. They were flanked by 3 young assistants dressed in sleek black uniforms. Derek wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. Chloe was draped in a stark white designer silk dress, her wrists flashing with heavy expensive gold bracelets. The scene looked exactly like a photo ripped straight from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Derek held a dark green bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and a crystal flute in the other. I watched silently as he popped the cork with a loud, obnoxious cheer. The young assistants clapped enthusiastically, playing their roles as a loyal audience. Derek poured the golden, effervescent wine into the cups his staff eagerly held out. I listened closely as Chloe raised her crystal glass high into the air, offering a loud, boastful toast to their upcoming massive expansion. With a layer of supreme, fake confidence, she spoke about a lucrative new commercial hotel contract and a massive injection of corporate funds, guaranteed to hit their bank account by Friday morning. She smiled, her expression radiant and perfect. She was actively and joyfully celebrating the successful theft of my 500-acre estate. She was drinking expensive champagne, toasting the forged document that would leave me entirely homeless. I began to walk slowly across the polished white concrete floor. I made no attempt to soften my footsteps. The heavy rubber soles of my work boots made a loud, echoing squeak in the open room, cutting right through the smooth jazz playing softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. I walked past displays of expensive French silk and imported Italian ceramics. The physical distance between the front door and that quartz island felt like a long corridor where tension was steadily building. My eyes were locked dead on my son. The young assistants were the first to notice the heavy footsteps. They turned their heads, breaking away from the celebration. Their enthusiastic smiles vanished instantly, replaced quickly by looks of supreme confusion and mild alarm. They looked at my muddy boots and worn clothes, clearly assuming I was a lost construction worker or a confused delivery guy who had walked into the wrong building. Then Derek turned around. The crystal champagne flute in his hand froze midair. The confident, arrogant color drained completely from his face during the single second his brain tried to process why his father was standing inside his private sanctuary. He recovered his composure quickly, covering his brief shock with a rigid mask of intense irritation. Chloe turned next. Her gaze traveled slowly from my boots all the way up to my face, taking in every speck of dust on my collar and every frayed thread on my jacket. Her beautiful expression contorted into a look of pure, unadulterated disgust and mockery. I had invaded her pristine, orchestrated temple, I brought the undeniable reality of dirt and honest labor directly into her perfect illusion of high society wealth. The cheerful celebration in the room evaporated instantly, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence that pressed heavily against the walls of the sprawling gallery. I stopped walking and stood completely still, waiting for them to make the first move. Derek set his crystal champagne flute down on the quartz island with a sharp, echoing clink. He wasn't smiling anymore. He stepped away from the group of bewildered design assistants and marched across the polished concrete floor toward me. His posture was rigid, stiff with a fury he was trying desperately to contain. He closed the distance between us, stopping just inches from my face. He lowered his voice, hissing through gritted teeth, so his words wouldn't echo into the back of the gallery. He demanded to know what the hell I thought I was doing in his place of business. Looking down at my faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots, he asked if I had completely lost my mind, walking into a luxury establishment looking like a drifter. He told me I was tracking actual dirt onto a showroom floor that was meant exclusively for high-end clients. Before I could even formulate a response, Chloe stepped up right beside him. She didn't bother lowering her voice. She wanted her staff to witness her authority. Crossing her arms over her expensive white silk dress, she looked at me with an expression that mixed deep pity with absolute disdain. She let out a loud sigh and shook her head, acting as if she were dealing with a lost child. She announced to the empty space between us that since I had missed the graduation celebration, it was probably inevitable that I'd show up looking for a handout. Chloe unzipped her designer handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a small piece of brightly colored plastic. Holding it between her perfectly manicured fingers, she thrust it out toward me. In a slow, patronizing tone, she explained that it was a $100 gift card to Texas Roadhouse. She claimed that since I couldn't make it to the party at the Petroleum Club, Derek and she had bought it specifically so I could go get myself a decent hot meal. She pressed the cheap piece of plastic against my chest, insisting I take it. She told me it was much better suited to my tastes than the vintage champagne and imported caviar they had served to their real guests. I slowly raised my hand and took the piece of plastic from her fingertips. I looked down at the bright red Roadhouse logo, the weight of the card feeling incredibly absurd in my palm. My son and his wife were currently trying to steal a $7.5 million piece of real estate from me. They had forged my signature and submitted a federal banking document to secure a $5 million commercial loan just to cover up their massive criminal debts. Yet here they were, standing in a bankrupt gallery entirely sustained by stolen client funds, arrogantly handing me a $100 gift card as a consolation prize for being excluded from their fake life. The sheer scale of their hubris was nauseating. I didn't break the silence. I shifted my gaze from the plastic card up to Chloe's smug face. She mistook my quiet observation for grateful submission. Flashing a cruel, self-satisfied smile, she took a step back to stand shoulder to shoulder with Derek. She told me I needed to understand my place in their new world. She explained that their social circle consisted of high-net-worth individuals, powerful investors, and corporate executives who expected a certain standard of elegance. She said flat out that my presence was a liability. She told me that looking at my calloused hands and worn-out clothes made her physically uncomfortable, and that it would completely ruin the perfect brand image they had worked so hard to build. Derek stepped forward again, emboldened by his wife's cold monologue. He pointed a stiff finger toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the street, abandoning any remaining pretense of family respect. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the door immediately. He claimed they were expecting an incredibly important visit from a private equity representative in less than an hour. He said this meeting would secure their financial future forever, and he absolutely refused to let a stubborn, old-school Texas hick ruin his shot at the big leagues. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a stain on his professional image. He told me to take the gift card, get in my ugly truck, and drive back to the woods where I belonged, away from his sophisticated life. Derek's verbal assault kept going, his volume and arrogance rising by the second. He bragged about the empire he was building. He claimed he had reached a level of wealth and influence that I could never possibly understand. He told me I had spent my entire life working with my hands like a peasant, completely lacking the vision and ambition required to survive in a modern business environment. He declared that he was a self-made man, that all of his luxury was entirely earned, and that he owed absolutely nothing to a father who would never comprehend what real power looked like. I stood completely still, absorbing every single word of his delusional rant. I let him empty his entire clip of insults. I watched him inflate his own ego, building his altar of lies higher and higher. I didn't feel the slightest urge to defend my honor or explain the $55 million sitting in my blind trust. I felt no need to tell him that the very floor he was standing on was actually funded by my silent generosity. I just let him construct his own trap. The higher he climbed on that ladder of arrogance, the more devastating the fall would be. I slid the plastic gift card into the front pocket of my flannel shirt, placing it right next to the folded copy of the forged deed transfer. The two items pressed against my chest were a stark contrast, perfectly representing their fatal miscalculation. I stood my ground, letting the sound of Derek's arrogant insults fade into the vast art space. The plastic gift card sat heavy in my breast pocket next to the forged deed. Derek was breathing heavily, his face flushed red from the physical exertion of feeding his own massive ego. He was waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for me to yell back to defend my dignity or storm out like a typically angry parent. I did nothing. I just watched him. I let the silence stretch out indefinitely, forcing him to sit in the incredibly uncomfortable atmosphere he had just created. I looked past his tailored navy suit, focusing on the glint of the expensive gold watch on his wrist. I kept my voice absolutely level and calm. I asked him a direct question. I asked him how exactly he had managed to secure such a massive corporate funding injection in such an incredibly short amount of time. I didn't frame it as an accusation. I just sounded like a confused country old-timer trying to understand the complexities of modern business. 德立克挺起胸膛，冷笑了一声。他说：“当你拥有正确的企业愿景时，真金白银流动得非常快。”他声称克洛伊的商业计划完美无缺，私募股权贷款人简直是在求他手下那几百万美元。他说话是带着一种绝对的信念，就好像他自己真的相信他捏造的现实一样。I slowly nodded my head as if absorbing his profound wisdom. I told him I'd been watching the financial news lately. I mentioned that aggressive private lending outfits usually require substantial physical collateral before handing out funds of that size. I asked him point blank what specific, tangible asset he had used to back a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. Chloe rolled her eyes aggressively. She stepped forward and told Derek not to waste his breath, saying that explaining high finance to someone who spent his days cutting wood and fixing junk cars in a dirty garage was like talking to a brick wall. She wanted to dismiss me completely, but Derek simply couldn't resist the urge to brag. His hubris demanded an audience. He looked down his nose at me, claiming he had leveraged his own immense corporate value. He said the banking executives looked at his portfolio, his wife's exclusive client list, and their massive future revenue projections, and decided they were a zero-risk investment. He lied flawlessly without a hint of hesitation or a break in eye contact. This was the pivotal moment. I had to give him one final opportunity to display even a shred of basic humanity or remorse. Even though I knew the ironclad proof sitting in my pocket, a small part of me secretly hoped he would pass the test. I locked my eyes onto his and lowered my voice. I asked him if he was absolutely certain his financial foundation was clean. I asked him if he had ever used anything that didn't explicitly belong to him to secure this luxurious new life. I warned him, speaking slowly and deliberately, that if a man builds his mansion on stolen land, the entire structure will inevitably collapse and crush him. The question hit a nerve, but it didn't touch a sense of guilt. It struck his fragile pride. He took an aggressive step forward, completely invading my personal space. His breath smelled heavily of expensive vintage champagne. He told me I was pathetic and deeply jealous. He said I was projecting my own lifetime of financial failure onto his massive, unprecedented success. He swore on his life that everything he owned, every dollar in his bank account, and every contract he signed was earned through his own pure talent. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and claimed I had never given him anything of actual value, and that he would never need a single thing from me for the rest of his natural life. That was the confirmation that his malice was absolute. He had officially sealed his own fate. He looked directly into the face of the man whose signature he had painstakingly forged, and he lied with terrifying conviction. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't a temporary mistake made by a fundamentally good person, driven by desperate panic. This was just a cold-blooded predator viciously protecting his stolen prey. I nodded, accepting his final answer. I told him I understood his position completely. I slowly reached my right hand into the breast pocket of my faded green jacket. Derek tensed up slightly, clearly expecting me to pull out that cheap restaurant gift card and dramatically slam it back into his face to show my wounded pride. Chloe crossed her arms, waiting for the emotional explosion she so desperately wanted to witness. Instead, my calloused thumb found the tiny physical slide switch on the side of the digital voice recorder, hidden deep within the coat's lining. The exact moment I had parked my pickup outside the gallery, I had activated the recording device. I pressed down hard on the switch. The tiny hidden device gave a soft click, saving the last 20 minutes of high-definition audio directly onto its internal storage drive. I had captured every single insult, every boastful lie, and his absolute denial of using stolen collateral. I pulled my empty hand from my pocket, letting it drop naturally to my side. I looked around at the design assistants, who were staring at us in dead silence, before shifting my eyes back to my son and his wife. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't make a scene. I just told Derek to enjoy his expensive champagne. I told him to savor every last drop right now, because when the real bill finally arrives, the taste of victory turns incredibly bitter. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the heavy glass doors. Behind me, I heard Chloe let out a loud scoff, dismissing my final words as the pathetic ramblings of a jealous old man. I heard Derek pour another glass of champagne, loudly announcing to the room that it was time to get back to celebrating their massive future. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped back onto the sun-drenched concrete sidewalk. The thick perfume of the fake luxury gallery vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of city exhaust. I walked back to my truck, holding the audio evidence that guaranteed his total destruction. I climbed into the cab of my pickup and shut the heavy metal door, instantly muffling the noise of the city traffic. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny digital recorder. Just to be absolutely sure, I hit the play button. Derek's arrogant voice filled the small cab of my truck, declaring that he was a self-made man who had never used anything that didn't belong to him. The audio was crystal clear. I turned off the device, placing it safely back in my pocket, alongside the fraudulent deed transfer. I turned the ignition key and the engine roared to life. I didn't drive back to my quiet ranch in the woods. I steered the pickup straight back to the towering financial district. Harrison had given me the exact address of Lone Star Capital during our meeting. It was time to formally introduce myself to the people who were itching to steal my land. The regional headquarters of Lone Star Capital took up the top 3 floors of a massive steel and glass skyscraper. I parked my pickup in a visitor spot and took the silent elevator straight to the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal a cold, intimidating reception area designed specifically to make borrowers feel small and powerless. The walls were paneled in dark walnut, and the floors were covered in thick, charcoal gray carpet. A security guard in a tailored suit watched me warily as I walked toward the main desk. The receptionist looked at my faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots, the exact same expression of disgust flashing across her face that Chloe had shown earlier. She asked if I was lost or looking for the freight elevator. I placed both of my calloused hands flat on her spotless marble desk. I told her I wasn't lost. I ordered her to call the regional director of commercial lending immediately. I told her to inform him that the primary collateral listed on the $5 million bridge loan for Chloe Sterling. Fine art was a complete fraud. The receptionist froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from her face instantly. She picked up the phone and dialed an internal extension, her eyes darting nervously down to my muddy work boots. In less than 2 minutes, a tall man in a sharp gray suit hurried out from behind a set of double doors. He introduced himself as Richard, the regional director. He looked frazzled and deeply unsettled. He quickly escorted me past security and into his private corner office, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind us. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. He didn't offer me water, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He sat down heavily and demanded to know exactly who I was and why I was making such an earth-shattering accusation against a commercial account they were currently processing. I didn't answer him right away. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my worn leather wallet. I slid my state-issued driver's license across the smooth desktop toward him. Richard picked it up and looked at the name. He looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. He recognized my name as the primary property owner listed on the massive loan application his company had just approved. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out the heavy envelope Harrison had prepared for me. I broke the seal and took out the original master deed to my 500-acre ranch. This wasn't a digital copy or a cheap printout. This was the original, legally binding document bearing the official seal of the state of Texas and certified by the Sterling Consolidated Blind Trust. I placed the heavy parchment directly next to my driver's license. I told Richard to look closely at the hard security clauses embedded in the second paragraph of the master deed. I explained that the property was locked within an irrevocable blind trust, and it had been for a solid decade. I stated clearly that the title was completely frozen, and absolutely no individual possessed the legal authority to use it as collateral for any financial transaction. Richard leaned forward, his face turning incredibly pale as he skimmed the dense legal text. He was a man who understood financial liability perfectly. He was realizing in real time that his aggressively predatory lending company had just authorized a $5 million payout based entirely on a forged federal document. If those funds were wired into Chloe's account tomorrow, his company would suffer a massive, unrecoverable loss and face severe federal scrutiny for failing to properly verify the collateral. Richard started to panic. He stammered incoherently, reaching for the phone on his desk to call his legal department and freeze the disbursement immediately. He claimed his company was the victim of a highly sophisticated case of identity theft. I reached across the desk, placing my hand firmly over his hand and the phone. I told him he wasn't canceling the loan today. I told him we were going to let the process play out exactly the way Derek and Chloe expected it to. Richard looked at me like I was a madman. He asked how I could possibly want to allow a fraudulent loan to go through when my own property was on the line. I took my hand off the phone and reached back into my pocket. I pulled out the small digital recorder and set it on the desk. I pressed play. The clear audio of my son bragging about his perfect business plan and flatly denying the use of any stolen assets echoed through the quiet executive office. Richard listened in shocked silence as Derek aggressively insulted me and claimed total ownership of his fake empire. I let the recording play all the way to the end before turning the device off. I looked the regional director dead in the eye. I explained that simply canceling the loan quietly wouldn't teach them a damn thing. They would just go find another blood-sucking predatory lender or forge another document. I told Richard that Derek and Chloe were hosting a grand charity art auction dinner. It was happening Friday night at a 5-star Dallas hotel, and they had invited wealthy private equity investors. They intended to celebrate the arrival of the bank funds that very night. I instructed Richard to freeze every single one of their personal and business accounts at exactly 5 p.m. on Friday, a full hour before their lavish dinner was set to begin. I told him to prepare a formal, notarized letter officially revoking the loan on grounds of criminal fraud. I stated that my attorney and I would deliver that letter to their dinner table ourselves. Richard stared at the original deed, the recorder, and my calloused hands. He realized he wasn't dealing with a clueless old-timer, but a mastermind orchestrating total destruction. He nodded slowly, agreeing to every single term. The trap was now fully armed and locked into place. Friday evening arrived, casting long shadows between the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. At exactly 7 p.m., the heavy mahogany doors of the most exclusive private dining room at the Ritz-Carlton in Dallas swung open to welcome the evening's elite guests. This was a venue that absolutely did not take public reservations. It was a fortress of culinary luxury, where the minimum spend for a single dinner was equivalent to a few months of mortgage payments for the average person. The air inside the dining room was heavy with the rich aroma of white truffles, roasted bone marrow, and vintage red wine. Muted, amber light poured through imported crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, flattering glow over the faces of politicians, corporate executives, and high society socialites. The ambient noise was a low hum of polite conversation and the clinking of heavy sterling silver against fine porcelain. The entire environment was engineered to project absolute power and unshakable financial stability. Deep within the dining area, hidden behind velvet curtains and heavy soundproof doors, was the private executive suite. This secluded room was typically reserved for the most sensitive business negotiations and the most extravagant celebrations. Tonight, it was occupied by Derek and Chloe. They had booked the room a week in advance, placing a massive deposit on a credit card that was already teetering on the edge of being maxed out. The rectangular conference table occupying the center of the room was draped in crisp white linen and adorned with towering centerpieces of rare white orchids. A dozen luxurious velvet chairs surrounded the table, each occupied by someone holding a heavy crystal glass. Derek and Chloe sat at the head of the table, playing the grand architects of this incredibly expensive illusion. Derek wore a brand new custom tuxedo that fit with razor-sharp precision. He had bought the outfit specifically for tonight, completely ignoring the fact that his bank accounts were entirely drained. He leaned back in his chair, projecting the relaxed, casual confidence of a man who managed millions of dollars on a daily basis. He swirled a glass of deep red wine, talking to the man seated to his right. His face was flushed with the thrill of victory. He was entirely convinced that the $5 million commercial bridge loan from Lone Star Capital had been successfully wired into his business account a few hours ago. He believed he had successfully stolen my 500-acre ranch, navigated the dangerous waters of commercial lending, and secured his lavish future without a single hitch. Chloe sat right beside him, radiating an aura of manufactured perfection. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown, the diamond necklace around her neck catching the ambient light with every slight movement of her head. She was fully in character, playing the part of a highly successful old-money fine art gallerist. She leaned across the table, deep in conversation with the wives of the wealthy investors. She described that entirely fabricated hotel art procurement project in vivid, excruciating detail, talking about commissioning massively expensive modern sculptures for the lobby and importing rare oil paintings specifically for the penthouses. The fluency of her lies and the sheer enthusiasm she projected completely captivated the women listening to her. She didn't show a single ounce of the crushing anxiety you'd expect from a woman facing multiple lawsuits for grand theft. She was completely wrapped up in her own massive ego. Their guests weren't fools either. They were cold-blooded private equity partners and aggressive venture capitalists, men with an almost supernatural ability to spot a bad investment from a mile away. The lead investor sitting to Derek's left was notorious for his ruthless business instincts and a massive commercial real estate portfolio. But Derek and Chloe had built a social-proof trap that was incredibly hard to see through. The investors looked around the private suite, taking in the rare orchids, the vintage wine, and the massive, undeniable material evidence of wealth. They naturally assumed no one would ever dare host a dinner of this scale unless they were already wildly successful. The sheer audacity of the lie made it completely believable. They listened to Derek's ambitious expansion plans and nodded their approval, completely unaware they were sitting at a table funded by stolen client money and federal fraud. The servers moved like ghosts through the room, anticipating every need before a guest could even ask. They kept a steady stream of top-shelf champagne flowing and served caviar on tiny mother-of-pearl spoons. Every single time a waiter presented a new bottle or a lavish appetizer, that invisible final tab was growing exponentially. When the head waiter asked if they should slow down the courses, Derek dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He ordered the man to bring out the most expensive things on the menu, declaring that tonight was a night of absolute victory. He was throwing stolen money into a roaring fire, completely blind to the fact that the flames were about to swallow him whole. The profound irony of the situation hung heavy in the air, completely unnoticed by anyone in the room. Derek and Chloe were sitting at the top of their manufactured mountain, enjoying the finest food in the city while holding the attention of the most powerful financial players in the state. They felt absolutely untouchable. Meanwhile, the financial foundation beneath their feet had already been completely hollowed out. At exactly 5 p.m. that afternoon, right when Derek was standing in front of his bathroom mirror, tying his silk bow tie, the regional director of Lone Star Capital sprung the trap. A secure digital command was sent through the banking networks, instantly freezing every single personal and business account tied to their Social Security numbers. Their credit cards were canceled. Their lines of credit were permanently revoked. The stolen deposit funds and the massive debts were officially locked down by federal fraud investigators. They were currently sitting in a 5-star hotel, consuming thousands of dollars worth of premium goods, with absolutely no way to pay the bill. They were completely, utterly broke, and facing severe federal criminal charges. But at this specific moment, isolated in the warm, glowing luxury of the private room, they knew absolutely nothing. They were completely shielded from the devastating reality waiting just outside the velvet curtains. The main course arrived. Waiters placed heavy porcelain plates in front of the guests, featuring perfectly seared Kobe Wagyu and a delicate truffle puree. The rich aroma of the food filled the room, taking the atmosphere to its absolute peak. Derek stood up from his chair, holding his crystal champagne flute. He tapped the rim of the glass with a silver fork, letting out a sharp, ringing chime that instantly quieted the room. The private equity investors stopped eating and looked up at him with polite interest. Chloe gazed up at her husband, her eyes shining with absolute triumph. Derek raised his glass high into the air, cleared his throat, and began to speak. He thanked the powerful men in the room for taking the time to share in this historic moment. He spoke about the value of a bold vision and the courage required to take massive risks in the modern business world. Looking the lead investor dead in the eye, he declared that this dinner marked the beginning of an incredibly lucrative, unstoppable partnership. He bragged that his family business was about to alter the entire landscape of the city, and he invited everyone to raise a glass to their guaranteed mutual success. The investors smiled and raised their glasses, echoing his arrogant cheer. The sound of clinking crystal filled the luxurious room, marking the exact moment the final second ticked down on their great illusion. The stage was perfectly set. The absolute peak of their hubris had been achieved, and I was standing right outside the heavy mahogany doors, waiting to rip it all to shreds. I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk outside the hotel, waiting in the biting night wind. I watched a line of luxury sedans pull up to the valet stand. Men in expensive wool coats and women in designer silk dresses stepped out, laughing softly as they were ushered toward the heavy front doors. I didn't walk over to join them. I kept waiting around the corner of the brick building until a deep blue sedan pulled up to the curb. Harrison got out of the passenger side, dressed in his standard charcoal suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. Two men climbed out of the back seat. They weren't dressed for a high society dinner. They wore dark, plain suits and sturdy leather shoes. Their posture was rigid and absolutely alert. They were FBI agents specializing in white-collar crime. Harrison briefly introduced them as Agent Reynolds and Agent Foster. We didn't shake hands. This wasn't a social gathering. It was a highly calculated tactical operation. We walked toward the main entrance together. The maitre d' stood behind a polished mahogany podium, and the moment he looked up, he raised his hand to stop us. He opened his mouth to inform me that I didn't meet their strict dress code, and that the restaurant was fully committed for the evening. Before he could utter a single syllable, Agent Reynolds flipped open a small leather wallet. A heavy silver shield caught the amber light of the foyer. Reynolds calmly ordered the maitre d' to step aside and point us toward the private executive suite. The color drained from the man's face instantly. He nodded silently and pointed down a long, softly lit hallway. We walked through the main dining room, our synchronized footsteps cutting sharply through the low hum of polite conversation. Wealthy patrons stopped eating, staring at us in pure confusion. They watched a country old-timer in a faded green flannel shirt and scuffed work boots lead a highly recognizable Dallas corporate lawyer and two obvious federal agents straight through their exclusive sanctuary. The ambient noise in the restaurant died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating wake of silence behind us. I didn't look left or right. My gaze was locked entirely on the heavy velvet curtain at the end of the hall. We reached the thick, soundproof door of the private suite. Through the heavy wood, I could hear my son's faint voice delivering his arrogant toast to his wealthy guests. I waited exactly 5 seconds, listening closely for the distinct clinking of crystal glasses. The exact moment I heard that fragile glass ring out to celebrate his massive fraud, I placed my calloused hand on the solid brass doorknob. I didn't bother knocking. I threw the door wide open. The transition was violent. The warm, celebratory atmosphere of the room instantly collided with the ice-cold, undeniable reality we brought with us. I stepped into the private suite with Harrison right behind me, while the two federal agents took their positions on either side of the doorway, physically blocking the only exit. Derek was still standing at the head of the long table, his crystal champagne glass held high in the air. A confident, arrogant smile was frozen on his face. He looked toward the open door, fully expecting a server bringing a fresh round of expensive vintage wine for the wealthy investors. Instead, he saw me. He saw the old Texas farmer he had explicitly banned from his son's graduation party. He saw the father he was trying to make homeless with a forged deed. That arrogant smile cracked and fell away like cheap plaster. His eyes darted nervously from my faded flannel shirt to the sharp, professional suits of the federal agents. His brain was desperately struggling to comprehend how his two entirely parallel worlds had just merged so violently in the exact same room. Chloe sat right next to him, her hand freezing midair with a small pearl spoon loaded with expensive caviar. The manufactured, glowing pride vanished completely from her face, replaced by a mask of absolute, naked terror. She recognized the severe, uncompromising look of law enforcement instantly. She knew exactly what she had done with her client's stolen money, and she knew the final bill had finally arrived. The private equity investors sitting around the table were plunged into deep confusion. The lead investor to Derek's left slowly set his glass back down. He looked at me, then stared straight at Derek, waiting for a logical explanation. He probably figured I was an angry, disgruntled employee, or maybe a confused old relative who had somehow slipped past the security desk. Derek opened his mouth to speak. He tried to summon his commanding, corporate voice to order the restaurant staff to kick us out of his private dinner, but his throat was bone dry. Not a single word came out. He could only gasp for air in sheer desperation. The shift of power in the room was instantaneous and absolute. He was no longer the master of his fake, wealthy universe. He was a cornered animal, his carefully crafted defenses completely stripped away. I began to walk slowly along the side of the long rectangular table. I ignored the wealthy investors in their expensive suits. I didn't look at the towering white floral arrangements or the decadent food resting on fine porcelain. My gaze was locked entirely on my son. In the dead silence of the room, the heavy rubber soles of my work boots let out a loud, echoing squeak against the hardwood floor. With every step I took, I was dismantling his carefully constructed illusion of wealth, brick by brick. I reached the end of the table and stopped right beside his chair, looking down at him. Harrison stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was loud, clear, and carried the absolute unyielding weight of the highest legal authority. He introduced himself to the room as the senior managing partner of his prominent corporate law firm. Then he gestured toward the two expressionless men standing by the closed wooden doors, introducing them as senior investigators from the Federal Financial Fraud Division. A collective gasp rippled through the seated investors. The lead investor immediately pushed his heavy wooden chair away from the table, physically creating a massive gap between himself and Derek. These men lived and thrived in the financial world strictly by avoiding any and all legal liability. The mere mention of a federal fraud investigation was like a highly contagious financial plague, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. The lead investor reached for his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, ready to abandon this fraudulent deal entirely. I reached inside the inner pocket of my faded green jacket and pulled out a thick, brand-new white envelope. It was stamped with the official gold leaf seal of the Sterling Consolidated Legal Trust. I held it in my calloused hand, feeling the heavy weight of the undeniable truth inside. I didn't politely hand it to Derek. I didn't give it to him to read privately in the hallway. I reached across the table and slammed that heavy envelope right down onto his spotless, fine porcelain plate. The envelope landed dead center on his incredibly expensive pan-seared Kobe Wagyu, instantly soaking up the rich dark brown reduction sauce. Chloe dropped her pearl spoon. It hit her porcelain plate with a loud ringing clatter. She stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. She looked at the federal agents standing by the door and began to shake uncontrollably. The lead investor didn't even wait for Derek to attempt an explanation. He stood up, completely disgusted by the massive legal landmine sitting next to him. He suggested to the rest of the table that they leave the room immediately. I looked down at my son, watching him shiver in his brand-new custom tuxedo. I spoke in a voice that was absolutely calm, steady, and carried the weight of a final judgment. I told him that the $5 million commercial bridge loan he was celebrating tonight had been permanently canceled. I informed the investors silently staring at us that the collateral used to back that massive funding was a piece of private real estate he had absolutely no ownership of. I made it crystal clear without a hint of hesitation that he had forged his own father's signature to steal a protected legal asset from a locked trust. I leaned in closer, gripping the back of his chair tightly with my heavy hands. I told him that the bank accounts he was desperately counting on to pay for this lavish five-star dinner had been frozen solid by a federal court order over 2 hours ago. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated panic. The full, crushing reality of his situation finally shattered him. The fake empire he had spent years building on lies and stolen money had just crumbled to dust right in front of his most important professional audience. I stood up straight and adjusted the collar of my worn flannel shirt. The truth was out in the open permanently, and the consequences were absolutely inescapable. The white envelope sat quietly on the ruined plate. The dark gravy from the Wagyu slowly bled into the edges of the thick paper, but the gold leaf seal of Sterling Consolidated remained spotless and untouched. The heavy silence in the private dining room was no longer just uncomfortable. It was a suffocating physical weight pressing down on every single person sitting at that long table. Derek stared at the envelope with his mouth open, unable to utter a coherent word. His face turned the color of cold ash. The arrogant, powerful corporate executive who had been commanding the room just minutes ago was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified little boy who had just been caught committing an unforgivable crime. Chloe was completely paralyzed beside him. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went stark white. Her gaze darted frantically between the federal agents at the door and the harsh, uncompromising face of my lawyer. She knew there wasn't a lie complex enough in the world to save them from this exact moment. The lead investor broke the paralyzing spell. As a man who managed billions in corporate assets, he had zero tolerance for mysteries or hidden liabilities in his business deals. He reached across the white linen tablecloth, his expensive suit sleeve brushing against a crystal champagne glass. Completely ignoring Derek, he snatched the heavy envelope right off the dinner plate. Derek twitched, making a pathetic, half-hearted motion to stop him, but the investor shot him a look of absolute ice-cold authority that froze Derek instantly in his chair. With a sharp, decisive motion, the investor tore open the thick paper seal. He pulled out the certified letter concerning the fraudulent collateral, along with the supporting legal documents my lawyer had prepared specifically for tonight. He put on his gold-rimmed reading glasses and began rapidly scanning the dense paragraphs. The entire room watched him in absolute silence. We observed his sharp mind processing the severity of the situation in real time. His jaw clenched into a hard, rigid line. His eyes raced across the pages, reading the specific details of the forged signature, the stolen property deeds, and the federal bank freeze. He was reading the live total destruction of his own upcoming multi-million-dollar partnership. The lead investor finished the last page. He slowly took off his glasses, folded them, and placed them carefully into his breast pocket. He laid the certified letter flat on the table for everyone to see. He looked at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He didn't shout or raise his voice. A man of his stature didn't need to yell to completely destroy someone. He spoke in a low, dangerous, and incredibly calm voice that carried to every single corner of the private suite. He stated that in his 30 years of managing private equity, he had dealt with bad investments, failed startups, and incompetent executives. But, he said, he had never met a man stupid enough to forge federal banking documents and then invite federal investigators to his own grand victory dinner. He turned to the other wealthy folks sitting around the long table. He informed them with absolute clarity that the high-end interior design and art consulting firm they were about to fund was completely bankrupt and operating entirely on stolen client money. He told them the collateral securing the loan was a total fraud, and that anyone staying in this room for another minute risked being named an accessory to a major federal financial crime. The reaction was immediate and total chaos. The powerful figures around the table didn't ask for further proof or argue legal technicalities. The presence of federal agents and official documentation from a veteran corporate lawyer were more than enough to trigger their fierce survival instincts. They stood up in unison, violently pushing their heavy velvet chairs back. The movement was so sudden that several chairs flipped over backward, crashing loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. The investors' wives, who had just been listening to Chloe brag about imported Italian marble, now looked at her with pure terror and disgust. They grabbed their expensive designer handbags and rushed away from the table, avoiding Chloe as if she had a highly contagious disease. Chloe tried to speak. She tried to force a confident laugh, claiming this was all a huge misunderstanding, a bad administrative, legal error, but her voice cracked into a pathetic whimper when one wealthy wife physically shrank back in disgust from her outstretched hand. The social destruction was instantaneous and completely irreversible. Chloe was no longer a sophisticated socialite and a visionary art dealer. She was now a publicly exposed common thief, watching her entire fake life turn to ash. Derek finally found his voice, but it was completely wrong. He scrambled up from his chair, knocking over his crystal champagne glass. The expensive vintage wine spilled across the white linen tablecloth, looking like blood spreading over snow. He chased after the lead investor, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands to grab the sleeve of the older man's suit jacket. He begged him to wait just a second in the middle of the room. He pleaded with him to listen to reason, claiming he could fix the paperwork and secure a completely different funding source by Monday morning. He promised that the luxury hotel project was still completely viable. It was the most pathetic display of desperation I had ever seen in my life. The lead investor slammed his arm back, ripping it away from Derek's sweaty grip. He spun around, pointing a stiff, commanding finger straight into Derek's pale face. He told Derek that he was completely blacklisted from every financial institution in the state. He promised he would personally make sure that no legitimate investor would ever take his calls or sit in a meeting with him again. He told Derek that his career was permanently over and that he should spend whatever time he had left finding a damn good criminal defense lawyer if he wanted to avoid spending the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. The wealthy guests flooded toward the exit, desperate to escape the toxic criminal atmosphere of the private suite. The two federal agents stepped back slightly, giving the fleeing investors just enough room to pass safely into the hallway, while ensuring Derek and Chloe remained trapped in the room. In less than 60 seconds, the lavish executive suite completely emptied of its high society audience. The grand, meticulously planned celebration had been entirely hollowed out. Only the miserable wreckage remained. Overturned velvet chairs, spilled wine, discarded cloth napkins, and half-eaten, incredibly expensive food littered the beautiful room. The silence that now hung over the suite was the silence of a graveyard. Derek stood all alone in the center of the room, his brand-new custom tuxedo looking completely ridiculous on a man whose entire life had just been legally and socially crushed to pieces. He looked around at the empty chairs and the ruined dinner table. He realized that every single thing he valued, his professional reputation, his wealthy network, his self-important social power, had evaporated into thin air. He had used his loyal father as a bargaining chip to trade for a seat at a table that no longer existed. He slowly sank to his knees on the polished hardwood floor, right in the middle of the spilled champagne. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, agonizing wail of a man experiencing the total, absolute collapse of his reality in real time. I stood at the end of the wrecked table, observing the absolute destruction I had orchestrated. The silent punishment was incredibly harsh, but it was also absolutely just. After the last wealthy investor fled the room, the heavy mahogany doors of the private suite remained slightly ajar. The absolute silence inside the luxurious space was broken only by the pathetic sound of Derek sobbing on the polished floor. He stayed on his knees, surrounded by spilled vintage champagne and overturned velvet chairs. Chloe sat paralyzed at the ruined dinner table, staring blankly at the gold leaf seal on the certified letter that had just destroyed her life. Harrison, the two federal agents, and I stood near the entrance, watching the total collapse of my son's fake empire. We didn't say a word. There was absolutely nothing left to say. The legal trap had sprung, and the structural damage was permanent. Just then, the heavy door was pushed fully open. The restaurant maitre d' walked into the room holding a sleek, black leather folder. He stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the bizarre and chaotic scene before his eyes. He saw the empty chairs, the ruined food, and the crying man on the floor. He saw the federal agents guarding the exit. High-end restaurant staff were trained to ignore the personal drama of wealthy clients. But this level of destruction was unprecedented. However, the maitre d' had a specific job to finish. The private equity investors had ordered thousands of dollars worth of top-shelf caviar, imported wagyu, and rare vintage wine before evacuating. The restaurant needed an immediate settlement for the consumed goods. The maitre d' carefully composed himself, stepped around a puddle of spilled red wine, and walked to the head of the table. He gently placed the black leather folder on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the fraudulent, certified letter. In a perfectly neutral voice, he announced that the total bill for the evening came to exactly $15,400. Derek didn't even raise his head from his hands. To a man facing decades in federal prison, the concept of a restaurant bill had completely lost all meaning. But Chloe possessed a different kind of desperation. She was entirely driven by the need to maintain appearances. She couldn't process a massive federal crime or upcoming prison time. Her brain desperately latched onto the immediate physical problem in front of her. She believed that if she could just pay this bill, she could somehow salvage a tiny fraction of her shattered dignity. She forced herself to sit up straight, using a trembling hand to smooth down the fabric of her expensive emerald silk gown. She reached for her designer handbag sitting on the floor by her chair and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. This was the primary card tied to her art gallery, the exact account she used to funnel stolen client deposits to fund her lavish lifestyle. Holding the metal card between her perfectly manicured fingers, she held it out to the maitre d' with a forced, shaking smile. She ordered him to run it immediately and bring her the receipt. She completely ignored my presence and the presence of the federal investigators. She was desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, sophisticated woman handling a minor social inconvenience. The maitre d' took the heavy metal card, nodded politely, and walked out of the private suite to process the transaction at the main terminal. The wait that followed was excruciating. I watched Chloe tap her long fingernails against the edge of the ruined table. Her eyes darted nervously toward the open door. She was clinging to a shred of desperate hope that the federal freeze I announced was merely a bluff, or that it hadn't gone into effect yet. She firmly believed her platinum status would somehow override a federal order. I knew exactly what was happening at the main terminal. I knew the digital system was communicating with the frozen bank servers and generating a cold, undeniable rejection code. The heavy silence in the room amplified the heavy breathing of Derek, who was still curled up on the floor, completely crushed under the weight of his own hubris. Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy door pushed open again. The maitre d' returned, but he wasn't alone. The general manager of the 5-star restaurant accompanied him. The manager was a tall, imposing man in a serious black suit. His expression was completely stripped of the polite deference usually reserved for wealthy clients. He walked straight to the head of the table and set the black leather folder back onto the white linen tablecloth, slowly opening it. Inside lay Chloe's heavy platinum card, resting right next to a long red receipt stamped with the words, "Transaction declined. Account frozen by federal directive." The manager looked down at Chloe, stating in a cold, uncompromising tone that her primary bank had completely rejected the charge. He informed her that the terminal displayed a rare code indicating a total asset lockdown on the account. Chloe stared at the red slip of paper as if it were written in an alien language. Her breathing became fast and shallow. She began frantically digging through her designer handbag, pulling out a handful of different credit cards. She produced a gold card, a corporate business card, and a premium travel card. She threw them onto the table in a messy, chaotic pile, demanding that the manager try every single one of them. She claimed it was just a minor glitch in the banking system, and that she possessed massive reserves of corporate capital. The manager didn't touch the pile of cards. He glanced at the federal agents standing near the doorway, then looked back down at the terrified woman. He stated that when the first terminal alert appeared, he had taken the liberty of calling her issuing bank directly. He informed her that her bank's fraud division had explicitly instructed him to confiscate any cards bearing her name. Reaching out, he swept the entire pile of plastic and metal cards off the table and slipped them directly into his suit pocket. Chloe let out a sharp gasp. The final shred of her fake reality vanished completely. She sat there in a wildly extravagant gown, surrounded by ruined luxury, completely and utterly broke. The manager offered no sympathy. He leaned forward, pressing his hands heavily onto the edge of the table. He told her that the restaurant had provided over $15,000 worth of top-tier services and goods. He stated that failure to pay for those services constituted criminal theft. He demanded an immediate alternative form of cash payment, or he would instruct his security team to contact the Dallas Police Department to file formal criminal charges before they ever left the building. Derek finally raised his head from the floor. His face was stained with tears, and his expensive tuxedo was ruined from spilled wine and floor wax. He looked at his wife, realizing that between the two of them, they didn't even have a single dollar. They couldn't even afford a cab ride home. The massive $5 million bridge loan they were celebrating last night was gone. The business accounts were gone. The stolen client funds were gone. They were completely bankrupt in the most public, humiliating way possible. The threat of local police action over a restaurant bill, piled right on top of the looming federal indictments, was the final blow that shattered his mind completely. I stood in silence, watching the manager push their downward spiral to absolute rock bottom. I had promised my son that when the real bill finally arrived, the taste of victory would turn incredibly bitter. He was now consuming that exact bitterness whole. I didn't offer to pay their bill. I didn't reach for my own wallet to save them from this final humiliation. I let them sit in the absolute mud of their own making. The federal agents took a step forward, ready to intervene and begin the formal process of their federal arrest. The grand illusion was dead. The silent punishment was absolutely complete. Exactly 7 days had passed since that night in the dead silent executive suite of the five-star restaurant. The weather perfectly mirrored the harsh reality of my son's new life. A relentless cold rain beat heavily against the tin roof of the tool shed on my Texas ranch. I stood inside, using a soft cloth to wipe down the dashboard of the Ford Bronco I had restored for my grandson. Over the past week, the local Dallas news had been completely consumed by the spectacular collapse of Chloe's art gallery. This wasn't a quiet business failure. It was a highly publicized corporate slaughter. The private equity investors had made absolutely sure that everyone in the financial district knew about the forged collateral and the stolen client deposits. Harrison had been keeping me updated on the rapidly unfolding legal and financial consequences. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. On Monday morning, the commercial landlord of the downtown art gallery locked the doors and slapped an eviction notice right on that pristine glass. On Wednesday, a repo company showed up at their suburban Highland Park home with flatbed tow trucks. They hooked chains to their 2 Porsches and dragged them right out of the driveway while neighbors throughout the community watched from their windows. On Friday, the primary mortgage lender officially filed for immediate foreclosure on their massive mansion, citing the federal fraud investigation as a catastrophic default. Their credit was entirely destroyed. Their bank accounts remained frozen, and the civil lawsuits from defrauded clients were flying in like a blizzard. The empire built on my forged signature completely dissolved in exactly 168 hours. I heard the heavy crunch of tires rolling over the wet gravel of my long driveway. I wasn't expecting any deliveries. I walked over to the garage window and looked out through the pouring rain. A battered yellow Dallas city cab was idling just outside the heavy iron security gates. The gates were locked tight. I watched the passenger door swing open. Derek and Chloe stepped out into the freezing downpour. The cab immediately threw it in reverse, pulled a U-turn, and sped back down the highway, completely stranding them out there. I walked out of the tool shed and stood under the deep awning of the porch, watching them approach the iron bars. The physical transformation was staggering. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, high society power couple drinking vintage champagne just a week ago. Derek wore a wrinkled gray hoodie that was quickly soaked through, plastering flat against his shoulders. He looked completely broken. Heavy, deep purple bags hung under his bloodshot eyes, and he hadn't shaved in days. He was shaking violently in the cold rain. Chloe was completely unrecognizable. There was no imported silk, and there were no heavy gold bracelets. She was wrapped in a cheap plastic poncho. Her hair was matted flat against her scalp, and the perfect makeup she usually used to project absolute power was entirely gone, exposing the pale, terrified face of a woman who had finally hit rock bottom. I zipped up my heavy canvas work jacket and stepped out into the rain, walking slowly down the gravel driveway. I didn't rush. I let them stand out there, gripping the wet iron bars, feeling the biting cold sink into their bones. I stopped right at the gate, keeping myself firmly on my side of the iron. I didn't unlock it. I didn't invite them in for shelter. I just looked at them. Derek gripped the metal bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. There were no arrogant corporate commands, and there was no demand for respect. When he opened his mouth, the first sound he made was a pathetic, broken whimper. He pressed his face against the cold, wet iron. He begged me to open the gate. He pleaded for just 10 minutes of my time, claiming they had absolutely nowhere else to go. He said the federal prosecutors were threatening 20 years in a maximum security prison if they couldn't repay the millions stolen from the gallery's clients. He cried out that all of their wealthy friends had completely abandoned them, the exact people they desperately tried to impress at that party. The people they deemed worthy while intentionally excluding me had blocked their numbers and locked their doors. They were now completely toxic assets. Chloe shoved her way forward, crowding the space next to Derek. The woman who had laughed at my work boots and handed me a restaurant gift card was now crying hysterically. She thrust her hands through the gaps in the iron bars, making a desperate clawing motion toward me. She begged me for forgiveness. She claimed she had been incredibly stupid, blinded by the immense pressure of running a high-profile business. She cried that she never intended to hurt me, and that she always respected my simple, honest life. The lie was so transparent, it was almost nauseating. She didn't respect my life. She only respected the massive fortune hidden inside the blind trust that she had just discovered during the federal investigation. Derek cut her off, his voice cracking over the sound of the rain. He brought up the blind trust. He told me he knew about the massive wealth Harrison was managing. He completely dropped any pretense of repairing our relationship and went straight for the money. He begged me to authorize the release of the funds. He claimed that $5 million was nothing to me, just a drop in the bucket of my total net worth. He swore on his life that if I just paid off the defrauded clients and hired a top-tier criminal defense team to make the federal charges disappear, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He promised to visit me every single week. He promised to be a perfect, dutiful son. He was trying to sell me the exact same fake loyalty he used to steal my land. Standing out there in the freezing mud, they poured out a flood of desperate promises and pathetic apologies. They offered to clean my garage. They offered to cook my meals. They promised to humiliate themselves in any way I demanded if I would just write a check to save them from the horrific reality of federal prison. The volume of their begging echoed through the surrounding woods. They firmly believed that because I was an old man and because I was a father, I possessed an infinite supply of unconditional weakness ready for them to exploit. They thought our biological bond would ultimately force me to break. They assumed that the sight of them shivering and crying in the rain would shatter my resolve and erase the fact that they had meticulously forged my signature to make me homeless. I stood in the rain, completely unmoved. I didn't feel a single drop of pity. The people on the other side of that gate weren't my family. They were ruthless financial predators who just happened to run out of victims. The tears running down their faces weren't tears of genuine repentance. They weren't crying because they regretted their horrific actions or felt guilty for betraying me. They were crying purely because they got caught. They were crying because the consequences of their massive fraud had finally landed, and they lacked the strength to face them. I watched the cold rain wash the last remaining traces of their fake elite life into the mud beneath their feet. I let them beg until their voices grew hoarse, until their desperate promises faded into exhausted, pathetic whimpers. I listened to the entire performance, and then I prepared to deliver my final judgment. The freezing rain continued to beat ruthlessly against the thick iron bars of the security gate. I stood motionless under the downpour, waiting for my son and his wife to completely exhaust their vocal cords. Their desperate whimpers and pathetic apologies gradually dissolved into the massive background noise of the storm. They stared at me through the wet metal bars with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the unconditional parental rescue they had always taken for granted. I looked at Derek, sunk knee-deep in the freezing mud, wearing a soaked hoodie that clung to his shivering frame. I looked at Chloe beside him, trembling violently in a cheap, transparent plastic poncho that offered zero protection against the biting cold. I observed their total physical and social degradation. I felt absolutely none of the parental guilt they were desperately trying to weaponize against me. My paternal instincts had died completely the exact second I saw that forged signature on the fraudulent deed. I took a slow, deliberate breath of the cold, damp air. I finally broke the long silence, speaking in a voice that was completely flat, stoic, and stripped of any emotional warmth. I told them that their theatrical performance was incredibly impressive. I told them that after personally destroying their own lives, they possessed a remarkable talent for playing the helpless victims. I spoke to Derek first. I looked straight into his bloodshot, panicked eyes. I told him I had listened very carefully to his pathetic apologies and his desperate promises of future loyalty. I told him he was talking as if he had merely made a bad business investment or a foolish mistake as a young man. I corrected his massive delusion with absolute ice-cold severity. I reminded him that he didn't make a mistake. He had executed a highly calculated, malicious, and perfectly orchestrated federal financial crime. I described the exact psychological process required to forge a federal document. I told him I knew he had spent countless hours sitting at his expensive mahogany desk, practicing the specific loops and sharp angles of my handwriting. He had studied my personal identity for the sole purpose of erasing my financial existence. He had walked into a title office and willingly signed away 500 acres of pristine land that took me a lifetime of brutal labor to earn. To cover up the massive criminal debts accumulated by his wife, he had actively, consciously chosen to put his own biological father on the street. I told him that a man capable of that level of deep, calculated betrayal did not possess a soul worth saving. Then I turned my full attention to Chloe. Under my cold, unyielding gaze, she physically flinched. I reminded her of the phone call from 2 weeks ago. I reminded her of the sharp, condescending laugh she gave when she told me I wasn't worthy of attending my own grandson's college graduation. I reminded her of the exact moment she stood in her bankrupt gallery, surrounded by stolen luxury, and smugly handed me a $100 gift card to Texas Roadhouse. I told her she had built her entire fake identity on despising honest blue-collar workers like me. She had spent a solid decade actively mocking my calloused hands, my faded flannel shirts, and my beat-up pickup truck. I told her that seeing her now, standing in the freezing mud, begging that same man for a massive financial handout, was incredibly poetic and perfectly just. I told her that her tears and fake apologies meant absolutely nothing to me, because they came entirely from a place of raw financial terror, without a single shred of actual human remorse. Derek gripped the wet iron bars tighter, weakly shaking the gate in a final, desperate attempt to interrupt my sentence. He cried out about the blind trust again, begging me to just sign a single piece of paper to release the $5 million they needed. He claimed that it was a father's fundamental duty to protect his only son from the horrors of a federal prison. I took a massive step forward, pressing myself directly against the gate, my face just inches from his. I told him the absolute, undeniable truth about the master trust of Sterling Consolidated. I plugged the reality straight into his ears. I explained that I had established that financial fortress 10 years ago specifically to protect him from his own greed. I had seen the early warning signs of his deep entitlement and his toxic obsession with fake wealth a long time ago. I hid my 55 million because I wanted to force him to build a legitimate, meaningful life with his own two hands. I wanted him to learn the true value of honest labor and personal integrity. I told him that opening the trust now and paying off his massive criminal debts would completely destroy the core purpose of my entire life's work. I stated, with absolute and uncompromising finality, that I would rather watch every single dollar in that massive account burn to ash before I ever handed a single penny to a thief who forged my legal name. I then laid out the terrifying reality of the future they were about to face. I told them I wasn't actively punishing them, nor was I seeking cruel revenge. I was simply refusing to interfere with the natural, devastating consequences of their own horrific choices. I explained that the federal prosecutors were going to tear their lives completely to shreds, and that I wouldn't hire a single lawyer or spend a single dollar to defend them. I told them the civil courts would strip away every single asset they had ever falsely claimed as their own. They would permanently lose their massive suburban mansion, their imported luxury cars, and every pathetic remnant of their fake high society reputation. I told Derek that he would stand all alone in a cold federal courtroom, admitting to his massive financial crimes, and that he would do it with absolutely no backup. I told him that when the federal judge announced his lengthy prison sentence, he would finally, for the first time in his pathetic existence, carry personal responsibility for his actions. The freezing rain fell harder, washing loose gravel down the steep slope of the driveway. I deliberately took a step back from the heavy iron gate. I told them that our relationship was officially and permanently severed. I explained that real family isn't just a biological accident, nor is it merely sharing a last name. Real family requires a solid foundation of mutual respect, basic honesty, and unconditional trust. They had completely destroyed those vital elements. I told Derek that he was no longer my son. He was just a desperate, terrified criminal who had tried to rob an old man. I told Chloe that she was no longer my daughter-in-law. She was just a common fraud, filled with a deep terror of a justice system she could no longer buy her way out of. I established a rigid, impenetrable boundary right there in the freezing rain. I told them that my 500-acre ranch was a peaceful sanctuary, reserved exclusively for honest, hardworking people, and that they no longer qualified for entry. Derek dropped to his knees in the thick mud, still clutching the iron bars, letting out a sharp, agonizing wail as he screamed my name. Chloe collapsed right beside him, burying her face in her hands and crying uncontrollably. I didn't look away, and I didn't show a single sign of weakness. I watched them break completely under the heavy weight of their own actions. I raised my right hand, pointing a calloused finger toward the empty, winding country road behind them. I delivered my final, uncompromising order. I commanded them to turn around, leave my security gate, and never return to my land for the rest of their natural lives. I told them that if they ever dared to contact me again, if they sent a letter, made a phone call, or showed up at my boundary, I would immediately have the local police arrest them for trespassing and stalking. I made it crystal clear that my absolute silence was the final gift they would ever receive from me. Without another word, I turned my back on them. I walked firmly and slowly up the gravel driveway, heading back to my warm, dry tool shed. I could hear their desperate screams echoing through the woods behind me, begging me to come back, pleading for a mercy they absolutely did not deserve. I didn't break my stride, and I didn't look back. I walked into the garage, shut the heavy wood door, and threw the deadbolt firmly into place, locking them out forever in the cold, dark storm. The violent storm that washed away the last remnants of my son's life finally died down just before dawn. The morning sun rose over the tree canopy, casting a bright, clean light across my 500-acre ranch. The air smelled of wet pine needles and damp earth. I spent the early morning sweeping fallen leaves off the front porch and organizing the heavy steel tools in my workshop. The deep silence of the countryside felt completely different today. It was no longer suffocating with the anticipation of conflict. It was a profound, absolute peace that only descends after a necessary destruction. I was standing at the workbench, running a calloused hand along the incredibly smooth, deep harbor blue paint of the Bronco's door, when I heard the distinct sound of a car engine turning off the main road and crunching onto my gravel driveway. I wasn't expecting any visitors. I wiped my hands on a clean cotton cloth and walked out of the garage. Stepping into the cool morning air, I looked down the long slope toward the heavy iron security gate. A bright yellow Dallas City cab had pulled up right outside the barrier. The vibrant artificial color looked completely out of place against the deep green backdrop of the forest. I watched the driver pop the trunk. The passenger door pushed open and a tall young man stepped onto the wet gravel. It was my grandson, Julian. He wasn't wearing the designer clothes his mother used to force him into for those high society social media photos. He wore a simple, faded canvas jacket, heavy denim jeans, and a pair of sturdy leather work boots. Julian walked to the back of the cab and hauled out two large, heavy canvas duffel bags. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look panicked. His movements carried a quiet, deliberate sense of purpose. He paid the driver through the open window and took a step back. The yellow cab pulled a clean U-turn and drove away down the highway, leaving Julian standing all alone outside my lock gate. He didn't scream my name or shake the iron bars like his father had the day before. He simply picked up his heavy luggage, walked up to the gate, and waited patiently. He knew I was there. He respected the boundary I had established, maintaining the dignity to wait for my permission to approach. I zipped up my heavy canvas jacket and began walking down the gravel driveway. With every step I took, the brutal reality of the situation became clearer. My son had raised this boy in a house built entirely on massive lies and stolen money. Julian had grown up surrounded by a toxic illusion of immense wealth and social superiority. I had kept my distance for years just to avoid his parents' suffocating arrogance. I didn't know what kind of man this boy had truly become. I stopped at the iron gate, looking at Julian through the thick metal bars. He looked exhausted. The physical toll of the past week was written clearly across his face, but his eyes were incredibly clear and steady. Julian set his heavy duffel bags down on the wet gravel. He looked me dead in the eye, offering no polite, meaningless greetings. He began to speak in a calm, measured voice. He told me that 3 days ago he had packed up everything he owned and walked out of his parents' house. He said he knew absolutely nothing about their $5 million commercial bridge loan, the forged deed, or the stolen client deposits until federal investigators showed up at their front door with a search warrant. He described the absolute chaos of the past week. He watched his mother screaming at banking officials and his father breaking down completely, deflecting blame for his criminal actions onto everyone else in the world. Julian took a deep breath, addressing the deepest betrayal first. He brought up the graduation party at the Petroleum Club. He told me he had begged his parents to invite me. He wanted his grandfather to be there to watch him celebrate his degree in petroleum engineering. His parents had flatly refused, claiming I was too busy with ranch life to attend. Julian told me he spent the entire night sitting in a corner at that party, watching his parents hand out business cards and pitch fake art consultancy projects to wealthy private equity investors. He realized that night that the party had never been about celebrating his hard work. It was a calculated networking event, and he was just a convenient prop used to secure a fraudulent commercial loan. He told me that when the truth finally came out, when he saw the foreclosure notices and realized his entire privileged life had been funded by stolen client money, he felt a profound, sickening disgust. His father had actually demanded that Julian help them hide their remaining valuable assets from the federal authorities. Derek wanted his own biological son to become an active accomplice in his massive financial fraud. Julian looked at me through the iron bars and said he flatly refused. He told his parents he would rather sleep on the streets than spend another second living in their criminal illusion. He packed his canvas bags, called a cab, and walked away from the toxic wreckage of their lives, completely turning his back on that fake high society world. Julian didn't ask me for money to pay off his massive student loans. He didn't ask for access to a trust fund or a comfortable monthly allowance. He gestured toward the dense woods and the sprawling pastures of the ranch. He told me that he had an engineering degree, but he realized he knew absolutely nothing about how things actually worked in the real world. He said he wanted to learn how to build a solid foundation. He wanted to learn how to work with his hands, how to do real physical labor, and how to live a life that was absolutely honest and authentic. He asked me if I needed a full-time apprentice or a ranch hand. He asked if he could stay in the small spare room above the garage, trading his labor for his daily room and board. I stood there in silence, processing his words. The contrast between my son and my grandson was absolutely staggering. Derek had stood in this exact same spot yesterday, crying in the freezing mud, begging me to rescue him from the legal consequences of his own terrible choices. Derek wanted unearned wealth and a total escape from personal responsibility. Yet Julian stood here today, standing tall and composed, asking only for a chance to work hard and learn the true value of integrity. He had navigated the absolute worst kind of toxic parenting and somehow emerged with a clean, honest soul. He chose the hard path of truth over the comfortable path of lies. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the main gate. I didn't say a single word. I simply slotted the key into the thick iron lock and turned it. The mechanism released with a sharp, crisp click in the quiet morning air. I pushed the heavy metal gate open, breaking the absolute boundary I had established just the day before. I stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter my land. Julian picked up his heavy canvas bags and walked through the open gate, leaving the fake outside world completely behind him. I locked the gate firmly behind him. The silent punishment completely cleared away the rot from my family tree, but it also perfectly preserved the only branch truly capable of bearing fruit. Together, we began walking up the gravel driveway, ready to build a completely honest future. We walked side by side up the long driveway, leaving the heavy iron gate far behind us. The morning sun was climbing into a clear blue sky, quickly warming the cool air and baking away the mud where my son had knelt just the day before. Julian carried his 2 heavy canvas duffel bags without a single word of complaint. His breathing was steady, and his posture remained perfectly straight. I led him past the main house toward the detached garage. An exterior flight of sturdy wooden stairs led up to a simple apartment, tucked directly under the sloped roof. I went up ahead of him and pushed open the solid wood door. The space inside was clean, simple, and built entirely for utility. There was only a basic iron-framed bed, a small wooden dresser, and a single window that offered a quiet view of the surrounding forest. There were no imported crystal chandeliers or expensive Italian marble like he was used to, but it possessed something far more valuable. It offered absolute tranquility and the quiet dignity of a space earned through honest intentions. Julian dropped his heavy bags onto the woven rug. He looked around the small room and let out a long, slow breath. The pressure that had been tightening his shoulders for the past week seemed to evaporate instantly. He looked at me and gave a genuine, quiet thank you. I nodded and told him to come on downstairs whenever he was ready. I stepped back out into the bright morning light and walked straight over to my workshop. I unbolted the heavy door and pushed it wide open, letting the fresh air circulate through the dusty room. The familiar, comforting scent of raw wood, motor oil, solder, and metal shavings filled my lungs. This place was my sanctuary. This was where raw materials were transformed into objects of lasting value through patience and dedicated physical effort. I walked to the center of the room and stopped in front of the restored blue Ford Bronco. I stood there listening to the sound of the birds singing in the ancient oak trees outside. A few minutes later, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel approaching the open doorway. Julian stepped into the workshop. He looked around at the heavy steel hand tools lining the walls, the massive cast iron air compressor, and the thick wooden workbench, scarred by decades of constant use. He took in the environment with the sharp, analytical eye of a trained engineer. He recognized the profound difference between a fake corporate office designed for show and a workshop that existed purely for creation. The morning sun streamed through the open doorway, catching the deep, rich blue tones of the Bronco's body. This was a machine rebuilt entirely by hand. The surface was incredibly smooth, polished to a mirror-like finish that gave off a warm, natural gleam. The wiring inside the engine bay was immaculate, with every bolt and fitting dialed in perfectly, requiring absolute precision and a mountain of patience to execute. This was a hardcore, heavy-duty truck designed to last for generations. It was the exact opposite of the cheap, disposable illusions his parents had constructed. Julian walked slowly toward the truck, his eyes widening in genuine appreciation. He gently ran his hand over the polished hood, feeling the cold, solid steel. He bent down to inspect the suspension and the heavy-duty chassis, marveling at the seamless connection of every single component. He understood that building a machine like this required hundreds of hours of grueling physical labor and intense focus. I stood beside him and told him the history of the truck. I explained that I'd bought this junked, rusted frame from a scrapyard over 10 years ago, saving it for a project that actually mattered. I told him that the week I started cutting away the first pieces of rusted iron was the exact same week he began his final semester of engineering school. I explained that a man entering a challenging career needed a solid foundation. He needed a machine that could take him out to remote oil fields, through muddy job sites, withstand the worst of the weather, and still bring him back home safely. He needed to build his future on things that were constructed through hard work and honest calculations. Julian stood up straight and looked at me, his eyes shining with a deep, unuttered emotion. He realized that while his parents were busy planning a grand fake graduation party to suck up to wealthy investors, I had been standing alone in this dusty, oil-scented garage, quietly building a monument to his true achievements. I reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out a heavy metal ring holding 2 polished brass keys. I held them out to him, letting them rest in my calloused palm. I told him the truck belonged entirely to him now. It was his official graduation present. I told him it was the first piece of gear for his new life. Julian reached out and took the keys, his hand brushing against mine, and I could feel the solid strength in his grip. He didn't offer any empty, boastful promises like his father always did. He didn't declare that he was going to conquer the world or become a massive corporate success. He just looked down at the keys in his hand and promised he would never take the truck, or the lessons behind it, for granted. He promised to treat the machine with respect, and to ensure that whatever work he drove it to perform would be absolutely honest and authentic. I looked at the young man standing before me, knowing with absolute certainty that the family legacy was finally safe. The toxic entitlement that had poisoned my son had completely bypassed my grandson. I turned away from the truck and walked over to a long wooden workbench against the far wall. I picked up a heavy leather tool belt and tossed it onto the wood. I pointed to a stack of rough, unpolished oak boards piled in the corner. I told Julian that the truck was his, but the rent for that small apartment above the garage was paid with daily sweat and blistered hands. I instructed him to grab a sanding block and start smoothing out the rough edges of the timber. I told him we had a long day of work ahead of us, and that we were starting entirely from scratch. Julian let out a genuine, relaxed smile. He slid the keys safely into his pocket and walked over to the bench. He picked up the heavy sanding block, feeling the rough grit against his palm. Standing right next to me at the wooden table, we began to work side by side in a comfortable, productive silence. The rhythmic sound of sandpaper grinding against rough oak filled the quiet workshop. It was the sound of a brand new chapter. The massive storm of federal fraud, fake wealth, and deep family betrayal was completely over. The silent punishment had cleared away the destructive elements of my life, leaving behind only what was real and lasting. I had lost a son to the corrupting influence of unearned arrogance, but I had gained a grandson with the quiet strength to build a legitimate, meaningful life. We stood side by side in that dusty, sunlit room, surrounded by the scent of raw wood and motor oil and the promise of a truly honest future. The old, toxic legacy was dead, and a solid, respectful foundation was finally established. The ultimate lesson of this story is that true wealth is never measured by the brand of a tailored suit or the size of a rented chandelier. It is measured entirely by the honesty of your daily actions and the strength of the foundation you build with your own two hands. Blood alone does not make a family. It merely provides the opportunity to create one. When that opportunity is maliciously squandered through immense greed and deliberate deception, those biological bonds must be cut without mercy to protect what is truly authentic. A life built on the shifting sands of stolen money and arrogant lies will inevitably collapse. But a legacy carved out of honest labor and mutual respect will stand absolutely bulletproof against any storm.